Hello and welcome to the India Briefing. This is Mukulika Banerjee from London, joined by my co-host Pragya Tiwari in New Delhi. So this is the last episode we are recording for 2024, and we thought it might be an idea to go over this year's events, the key stories that stood out for us, books we have read, films that we have watched, fears and anxieties about the future, but also what can we hope for in the coming year. So, Pragya, let's start with your first set of observations about the big stories of 2024 that really stood out for you. And of course, because this is the India briefing, we should tell our listeners that we are going to focus mainly on the India related issues in this episode.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mukulika. And it was a big news year world round. I'm wearing a t-shirt that was gifted to me by my stepkids, and it says Pragya, the original brat, harking back to Kamala Harris's campaign, which is, of course, now a sore point in memory. But since we're sticking with India, I think you said this in the introductory episode of TIB, that just the media landscape of India, because there's just so much happening at any given point in time. Picking 2 or 3 stories that stood out is always an arduous task. But I think for me, if I have to think of the 2 stories that will be the 2024 stories for me, one will be the consecration of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya. Now, this is a culmination of sorts of a movement that started in the 80s. It changed the politics of this country, brought the BJP into the forefront and eventually to power. It was also at the center of at least 2 very violent moments in the history of modern India in 1992, when the Babri Masjid was demolished, where the Ram Temple now stands, and the riots that followed, the blasts in Mumbai that followed, ostensibly as a reaction to the riots. And then, of course, in 2002, the massacres in Gujarat that also started with the torching of a train that was coming from Ayodhya with Kar Sevaks, people who were activists for the building of a Ram temple and on the disputed territory. So, it feels like a culmination of sorts, but it's also the beginning of something perhaps that we don't understand very well. One could say that by consecrating the temple himself, the Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, has brought to fruition the dream of a Hindu Rashtra, or a Hindu nation, which becomes the de facto entity of the Republic, despite the fact that, of course, we are on paper a constitutional democracy. Now, what that will really mean for the day-to-day life of the Republic, its citizens, we are yet to find out. So definitely, perhaps the most important news event, political event of 2024. Me, my family is from Ayodhya, so also something that's deeply personal in terms of, the history of my own family and how I look upon these events. And the second, perhaps it was an election year. We've had a number of elections in India, but the general elections came on the heels of this grand consecration ceremony. BJP had had successes in the last year in the state elections. They looked like they were on such a strong wicket that it felt like the results of these elections would be a foregone conclusion, with the BJP gaining majority with ease. In fact, so much so that the slogan for the BJP was "Ab ki baar 400 par," that they would themselves be able to get more than 400 seats. That was the sort of projected image. But when the results were out, the BJP, of course, they ended up forming the government, and Narendra Modi is still the prime minister for the third term, but they did not get a clear majority. They performed not to their own expectations, and definitely perhaps the opposition ended up performing better than they expected to perform. And for me, I think that was really important. This is not about my personal preference in terms of one party winning or another party losing. And the BJP has since then done very well in state elections, particularly in Maharashtra and Haryana. But for me, I think it was a big moment, because despite all that we complain about and we worry about when it comes to India's democracy. I think this was a timely reminder that it's despite the fault lines, it's a robust democracy, and we can't really take it for granted. We cannot take the Indian voter for granted. So in that perspective, not because of who won or who lost or who got how many seats, this was a major news event
absolutely.
for
Both
me. I
of those
wonder what it
things,
was for
that
you,
Raman
Mukul.
did inauguration in January, and then 6 months later, the Indian elections. But just taking off on what you said, if one thinks about this year has been endlessly, it's been noted by everybody all over the world. It was just the most extraordinary year for elections, but also for democracy, just like you're saying. I mean, more than 1.5 billion voters across 73 countries went to the polls this year. I mean, it's an extraordinary statistic. It's never happened in the history of democracy. So it was actually, a bumper year for somebody like me, who for the past 25 years has been studying elections and democracy in India. One was on hyper alert all year, watching, starting with Taiwan, Indonesia early in the year in January, right down to Ghana in December, the last elections. But thinking about India, it was interesting. I agree with you that there is no taking for granted how an electorate is going to behave. Mr. Modi's particular conduct or during that inauguration of the Ram Temple, no priests, no other attendants, no other BJP leaders, Mr. Modi himself presiding over this grand religious ceremony, was very interestingly read by his supporters. So when I was in India for 5 weeks in April, May doing research on a different topic, but of course, the election campaign was on and people were going to vote over that 7 week period. One of his own supporters said, "Nir to Modi ji ne apne liye banaya hai." Mr. Modi has built that temple for himself. We need something for us. And when you say just now that, you can't take the vote for granted, yes, he's delivered on a very important promise of Hindu Rashtra, of the Hindu nation. But the electorate is not easily bought over by that kind of delivery. What's the next thing? Because at the moment, of course, the crisis of this combination of high economic growth with the lack of job creation, which has been the story in India for sure, and indeed elsewhere. But in India, it's particularly acute because it is forecast to be the fastest growing economy. The World Bank has just revised its figures and it's predicted 7% growth next year. But your average Indian citizen is not feeling that economic growth. The effects of that economic growth are not being enjoyed by people in terms of better jobs. The price inflation is through the roof. So people are feeling the pinch massively. Taking off from your observations, I would say this was the first big thing that I've been thinking about all year, thinking about democracy and electorates. But the second big thing is that because I've been studying elections for so long and have been really quite nerdy about looking at electoral process and Election Commission of India and its conduct of elections and so on, this has also been the year where India has had its national elections and some pretty major state elections that we've covered in this podcast. But never has been there a year when so many questions have been raised about electoral conduct itself, where simply the numbers don't match. The impartiality of the Election Commission has been called into question. So I think India, given it's the largest democracy in the world, conducts elections at a scale that are unmatched by any continent, forget country. Really, the story of electoral probity and the lack of it in 2024 has been a big sort of red warning for me about India's elections this year.
Right. No,
I
this
hope
is
we
something
will.
that,
Yeah.
Mukulika, we also must cover in some detail in the episodes to come, because like you said, it's not the first time the questions have been raised about the conduct of elections or the functioning of EVMs. But I think the scale at which questions have been asked and the fact that the space for having this conversation seems to be shrinking, because it almost from the word go tends to get labeled as a partisan conversation, that your party, the party of your choice, the party that you don't favor has won or not won, and therefore, and I think that to me is
I
almost as
agree.
disturbing as the raising of these questions themselves. And it stands to reason that every single party, whichever side you belong to, should be interested in making sure that we have this conversation, because the future of all of us, including the parties that are winning or not doing so well, depends on how robust the democracy and the democratic institutions, and most importantly, the faith on the electoral process is going forward. So this will be one thing that I will be watching quite closely, and I hope to cover this. I hope we will be watching this quite closely as well in the next year. And I think the other thing that you mentioned, the economy, is also something that we should keep an eye out for, because India is one of the largest economies in the world. It's poised to be the fastest growing economy. When we started out this the beginning of this year, we were looking at very robust, resilient growth. Many other indicators are still quite positive, but like you said, there are inflationary pressures. The rupee is falling; it's hit a record low against the dollar. Consumption is slow, and the growth has not been, even though it has been a constant growth, or it hasn't been what it was expected to be. So the projections have been lowered, and I think it'll be interesting to see how the story unfolds next year. I think the one story that I'll really also be keeping an eye out for is, I don't know how many people will be aware of this, but it's what happens to the Places of Worship Act. And I'll quickly give a very quick background to this. And again, perhaps we can cover this in more detail in one of our episodes to come. But essentially, because India is such a multi-layered civilization, layer upon layer of civilization has come to every corner of India, you can essentially raise a dispute about any given place of worship and say it used to be a temple, it used to be a mosque, it used to be a Buddhist stupa, and that claim might not even be unfounded. So given what happened in Ayodhya, we saw the passing of an act that essentially said that whatever the status of a place of worship was in 1947, that will be deemed to be what that structure is to be recognized as and remain as. Now, after the consecration of the Ram Temple, we saw sort of a slew of suits of court cases, which was sort of Me Too kind of, aping that particular court case, saying that this particular structure, and largely they were to do with structures that are currently mosque or Islamic structures, saying that they used to be temples. And there was an offhand remark made by the previous Chief Justice of the Supreme Court saying that, there's no, the Place of Worship Act does not preclude surveying any particular structure to determine whether or not it is what it stands as. Now, what has happened is that that led to a number of court cases and some violence very close to in the state of Uttar Pradesh, not very far from New Delhi, in a place called Sambal. And the current Chief Justice of India has put a stay on all of these. They are not admitting any fresh suits of this nature. And he said that he's going to first deal with the challenge to the Place of Worship Act to see whether or not this act is constitutional. So I think this is going to be a big story that I will keep an eye out for. The communal relations in India will turn to a great degree on how this plays out. Very interestingly, the head of the RSS, Mohan Bhagwat, which is the parent body of the sort of fountainhead of Hindutva ideology, if you will, and the parent body of the Bharatiya Janata Party, the head of that body, Mohan Bhagwat, has warned against opening up these kinds of suits. He has said that one shouldn't go looking for a Trishul, which is a trident representative of Lord Shiva, under every Islamic structure. He has tried to rein this fervor in, but from the right of the RSS, which is becoming an actual ideological position, he has met with a lot of pushback on this. So this is something I will be looking out for. I'm wondering if there are any stories that you are waiting to see how they develop.
Important one is the story of taxation in India. It's quite interesting, Pragya, that where I live in the UK, watching Western democracies, watching elections comparatively, all, next to each other this year, the tax policy of a government is like a big electoral issue in a lot of countries. What is going to be their taxation policy? Now, in India, almost every issue has a politics, and almost every Indian has an opinion on big issues. People think they like to talk and debate and argue about political issues. So I find it baffling that the politics of taxation, what is the tax policy of a country and what its relationship to politics is, this never becomes an electoral issue. Now, I say this particularly because I've, as you know, started some new research this year, and I, spent many weeks. I'm doing this. I was doing the first part of this research with my colleague from LSE, Pavitra Suryanarayan, and we spent a lot of time this summer traveling around India, talking to bureaucrats, traders, tax lawyers, tax advisors about this new big ticket reform that the Modi government brought in its first term. In 2017, the goods and services tax, right? GST, as it's called. One nation, one tax, fantastic tax reform. Earlier, India's tax landscape on indirect taxes was very complicated, and this GST tax was meant to replace all of that complicated mirror thing. So, in principle, a very good thing. I think everybody agrees that it was much needed and glad that India's done it. The implementation of it, however, has been much more complicated and murkier and full of all kinds of inefficiencies, so much so that the rules for GST, since it was introduced in 2017, have been amended 780 times in 7 years. So you can realize, the implementation was anything but perfect. But the larger issue that interests me, and looking forward to 2025, given the rumblings that have started in December on in the press in India, and people writing about it, is that for a good democratic culture, enough research has shown that direct taxes like income tax, corporate tax, these are good for creating robust democratic culture because people are aware of what they're paying and then they can hold the government accountable in return. Indirect taxes like sales tax, VAT, etc., are considered more regressive, because they're like they're invisible. You don't see what you're paying. The price rises it's absorbed in price inflation. Sometimes it's not meant to be, but it is. In India, indirect taxes contribute marginally more than direct taxes, which means that given this is a largely poor country, 800 million people of India's population rely on food rations just to survive. Right? We're talking about the scale of poverty. There, when there are indirect taxes on goods which are paid equally by the poor and the rich, you think it would become a huge issue in public discourse. But it doesn't. And I think recently the finance minister's comments in December this month about increasing tax on different kinds of popcorn were going to be taxed in different ways. Did your popcorn come in a box? Did it come loose? Was it salted? And, was it salted caramel popcorn, etc.? I mean, there are lots of memes, as you can imagine, out of this. But, people pick this up, but it's not enough that food, everyday consumables are being taxed at rates that people cannot even see. And most importantly, the poor in India are paying more in tax proportional to their income than the rich are. In a country, like I said, of so many poor people and where social inequality is going up and where crucially corporate tax has been brought down from 2014 levels, this seems to me a perfect storm for a political issue. And I'm really hoping that in 2025, at least political parties in opposition and civil society groups make this much more salient.
No, absolutely, Mukulika. I cannot wait to read your book because I've been I've been fortunate in the sense that while you were here, while you were in India, while you were doing your field work, we were in touch and you were talking to me about, all kinds of conundrums and conversations that this research was throwing up. And I think it's such a fascinating area of research. And I think the potential is just limitless. And I know if there's anyone who can do it justice, it's you. So I cannot possibly wait to start reading even earlier drafts of your work. But I think more so than ever this year in December, when news broke that different kinds of popcorns was to be taxed differently, was different levels of the goods and services tax were to apply, and that led to any number of opinion pieces in which yes, minister was liberally quoted in many of them. And of course, it birthed some of the greatest memes that we've seen come out this year, or at least from India. I was thinking that, I think that this book cannot come out soon enough. So no pressure, but I hope you'll get to, working on
Just
it
to
as much
stop
as you
you there,
can,
since
as
this
early
is
as you
published,
can.
I am
But,
the pressure.
so far,
you are putting pressure by asking for a book. I think we're going to write a really kick-ass paper to start with, and then we certainly have material for a book. But both Pavitra and I are full-time jobbing university academics with time to write books.
I completely understand that, but we've had this conversation offline, and I don't think I'll let you off the hook until you agree to write this book. It's going to be a travesty if this book doesn't exist. And if I have to, whatever I need to do to make sure it does, I'm going to keep at it. So, yes, looking forward to the paper, looking forward to the earlier drafts of the paper, but definitely looking forward to convincing you, both of you, to turn this into a book. I think before we round this off, we've lost a lot of people this year in terms of public figures, but I think December has been a particularly cruel month. So I thought that it would be amiss not to sort of doff our collective hats to Zakir Hussain, the tabla player who passed away, a couple of weeks ago. Incidentally, Zakir Hussain won a Grammy earlier this year. Hopefully everyone is aware of his legacy and of the just staggering talent and the body of work that he leaves behind. But just personally speaking, I had the privilege of watching him in concert, in an intimate concert. So year on year at the Prithvi Theatre, which is in Mumbai, he used to perform on the same date in February in honor of his friend Jennifer Kapoor, who was one of the two founders of the Prithvi Theatre, married to Bollywood actor Shashi Kapoor from what can be called the first family of Indian cinema, the Kapoor family. Of course, Zakir was a genius. And of course, there are very few musicians of note that can compare to his caliber of talent. But I think what really moved me was this commitment he made to a friend 40 years ago. And year on year, he curated this concert on the very same day. And I think, to my mind, that was just revelatory of the kind of human being he was. And this year in February, I had the honor of seeing him in concert for a couple of hours. This used to be an intimate concert because it's by invite only. With his brothers, he
Lucky
played,
you.
and
This is
I'm just so privileged
what
that I
an
could
extraordinary.
catch
That's
that.
such a lovely story, because most of us have seen him on stage across the world. But this story about his commitment to Jennifer Kapoor, also known to the world as Jennifer Kendall, and a sister of Felicity Kendall, of another theatre royalty family from Britain, says so much about him. And you know what? I grew up listening to Zakir Hussain, our student-led movement in India, Spikmake, which brought the top artists to Indian universities, colleges, schools. I was very involved in Spikmake for many years, all through my university years in Delhi, and have therefore picked him up from airports and railway stations and settled him into green rooms and spent some time. We really got to hang out with artists and get to know them. And the story you just told us doesn't surprise me, because that's exactly how I remember him, even as an undergrad, where he was the absolute heartthrob of every young female in India and elsewhere. He wore it very lightly. There was never any sense of vanity. There was great playfulness and showmanship on stage. I mean, he was a complete master of his instrument, the tabla. But internationally, what Zakir Hussain did with Shakti and creating a band Shakti with other musicians, so much of his music was collaborative. Even though he was such a brilliant artist in his own right, he produced a new kind of music which made Indian music cool. It made it organically part of other ensembles, but he did it through the spirit of collaboration with other musicians. And so it was very interesting when Zakir Hussain passed away this month at, the relatively young age of 70 odd. The mourning was for the passing of a great talent, but also the passing of friendship and collaboration that is much more rare than talent, and echoes perfectly with the story that you just told us and shared with us. Of course, we also lost Sham Benegal, didn't we, this month? Another great. He died at the age of 90. In fact, this month there were such wonderful celebrations of Sham Benegal's cinematic oeuvre. He was a complete stalwart of the art house cinema movement in India. And again, for my generation, it's impossible to think of growing up in India in the 80s without Sham Benegal's films, though he continued to make films right up until quite recently. And he made films, but he also made some really formative television documentaries, which went on Indian state television, Bharat Court being the most famous one based on Nehru's discovery of India. So Sham Benegal's passing, again, like Zakir Hussain's, these are people who put India on a global map by competing with the best globally, but also in the national context. These were people who paved the way for a newness in an art form, whether it was Indian classical music with Zakir Hussain or cinema with Sham Benegal or television, that created a new kind of storytelling and new stories. My goodness, I mean, Sham Benegal's films as a young female teenager in India were startling for their radical content, weren't they? I mean, you're a bit, you're slightly a generation, maybe not an entire generation younger than mine, but you came into Benegal's later films probably later, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, you mentioned the
Yeah.
spirit of collaboration and friendship. That's what we were talking about as perhaps, as an equal part of Zakir's legacy. And I think the same holds true for Sham Babu as well. He brought together these talents that and fostered them. And in the spirit of the friendship and collaboration that they shared, they sort of, that collaboration was also what underpinned the parallel cinema movement in India. And one of the last public images that we have of Sham Babu before he passed away, he celebrated his 90th birthday and he was surrounded by a lot of the actors and a lot of the talent that he brought together, that he fostered, that he nurtured, and the friendships that were made along the way that were, perhaps in the shadows, but a very strong, untold story of the parallel cinema movement of India in the decades after India got freedom and was fostering a new identity for itself and a new path for its future. So I think that that's something that can be said to be common between Zakir Hussain and Sham Babu. And of course, the third person that we lost a couple of days ago is former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. India is still in a state of, official period of mourning. Even as we record this, events have been cancelled. Any number of New Year Eve parties and functions have been cancelled in the city as well. And for most of the tributes that are pouring in, quite rightly so, talk about his contribution as Prime Minister, but also his contribution to the liberalization of the Indian economy. He was one of India's foremost economists before he was Prime Minister, and in fact, also the governor previously of India's central bank. While, of course, that is the crowning glory of his career, I think because I live in Delhi and a lot of people happen to know him personally, and a lot of conversations have been of a personal nature. I think in the last couple of days, what I found myself thinking about when I'm listening to these personal stories and these personal recollections is that we're often so cynical about politics, about politicians, how rigged the game is in terms of who can make it to the top, and whether or not corruption is something that can be dehyphenated from political life and politics in general. And then comes across someone like Manmohan Singh, who was as upright as impossibly upright and as impossibly principled as a human being can get, and yet made it to the very top of public life in India. And I think that should also be remembered as his legacy, and of some ray of hope that we can hold on to when we feel altogether defeated about the future
Yeah,
of
I
politics and
agree
futures
about
of
Manmohan Singh.
democracies
I mean, it's
around the
interesting
world.
reading the tributes. They seem to be in equal measure about Manmohan Singh, the man, and his integrity and his brutal honesty, as his sterling role as finance minister in 1991, ushering in that era of reforms to the economy. But Pragya, now because it's been a few days and one's had time to take stock, and I've been thinking that it's interesting, though, that everybody talks about India's liberalizing of its economy and the economic reforms that he brought in under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao as Prime Minister in the early 90s, which radically changed India as a country. But later, when one thinks about when he's Prime Minister, right, in 2004 to 2009, and then the UPA government comes back from 2009 to 2014, that UPA won 2004 to 9 when India's economy is very strong, it's growing, it's doing very well, everybody's sitting and taking up notice. It's the first time that the competition with China gets articulated in with India. It really wasn't on the table until then. China is growing at this incredible rate. But what to me as an anthropologist, as an observer of India, is very striking is that this is not just a growth story. There is a serious commitment to redistribution alongside that growth. That is what is different, right? So there is a clear commitment, which is an ethical commitment, a political commitment, even as an economist, if I may say this, to making sure that the growth of the economy cannot be the be all and end all unless the benefits of that, the profits of that, trickle down was a famous phrase that was used in those days, but redistributed. So actually pulling 200 million people out of poverty, which is a Herculean task, was important. But more importantly, that redistribution or welfare was not done in a language of handouts. It was done through a language of rights, which again, for the democratic project in India was so important. It wasn't about, oh, you're poor, here's some free food to stay alive. This was, you are a citizen of India, you are a rights-bearing citizen, and therefore some key legislation came in at exactly that period of high growth where people were guaranteed income. Right, the largest employment guarantee scheme anywhere in the world was introduced, where rural citizens were guaranteed 100 days of work a year, the right to information, the right to education. These were rights based welfare. And I cannot but reflect on this, especially now you and I have, in these episodes talked about direct benefit transfers, or we've talked about the food rations that people rely on. There is a shift, right, from that language of rights to a language of what Yamini Iyer calls the La Bharti state, that you turn people into recipients rather than rights-bearing citizens. And I think a lot of the mourning of Manmohan Singh's passing, he lived to a good. But the mourning is really, I think, also a mourning of a different kind of, like you say, a different kind of politician, but also a different kind of imagining of the public good, or different kind of imagining of what economic performance is for ultimately. It's not for a few cronies, for a few rich. It is for everybody. And the country rises, all boats rise, that kind of philosophy.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying this. This is so, so, so important. This is such an important point. Okay, so I was thinking that before we close this, perhaps we could talk a little bit about what we've been reading, what we've been watching, what we see as our books of the year, films of the year. It's been a very good year for reading for me. I was telling you this earlier offline, but, I can't remember a single year in my adult life when I've been able to say at the end of the year that I've read enough this year But I think this year I am very nearly able to say that. So that's been very thrilling. But that also makes it kind of very challenging to narrow down books that I would recommend. Fortunately, we're just talking about India, and a lot of my reading came from outside India this year. So that makes the task a little bit easier. So I'll start with some of the recommendations, some of the books I've enjoyed, and perhaps then you can take on. So when it comes to history, I think William Dalrymple's Golden Road, How Ancient India Shaped the World, is just an absolutely astonishing read. It's been topping bestseller lists everywhere. So I'm sure most people who are listening to this have already heard about it, but I think it still bears reiteration. It's a fantastic book. The Lion and the Lily, I really enjoyed, by Ira Mukoti. She's a historian of medieval India, and she writes about the Nawabs of Awadh. Awadh is the region where Ayodhya, Lucknow, all of these, formally it used to be known as, formerly and formally it used to be known as the Awadh region. So it's about the Nawabs of Awadh, of Lucknow and Ayodhya, and I really, really enjoyed reading that. And Banu Pillai's Gods, Guns and Missionaries, which is about the shaping of the modern Hindu identity, is also an extraordinary book. So all these three books, they are sort of, non-academic historians writing a popular history, if you will, in a popular format, but they are extraordinary works of scholarship as well. So highly recommend these three. So when it comes to fiction, I largely read fiction from outside the country, but I think four books that really, really stood out for me. One is Never Never Land by Namita Gokhale. The other is Swallowing the Sun by Lakshmi Puri. And the third is Rosarita, all three female novelists by Anita Desai. Of course, she's a veteran novelist. She's 87 years old. It's a small novella that I absolutely loved. And the fourth was Lorenzo Searches for the Meaning of Life by Upamanyu Chatterjee. Lorenzo Searches for the Meaning of Life incidentally also won the JCB prize. So anybody who outside the country wants to keep an eye on what's exciting, what's going on that is interesting in the fiction landscape from India should definitely keep their eye out for what gets nominated or shortlisted for the JCB prize, which is run by Meeta Kapoor. And I think by and large, if you read whatever is nominated for awards for the JCB award, you'll have a pretty good list in your hands. But before I stop talking about the books I have read this year, I wanted to mention a couple of memoirs and quasi-memoirs. I just finished reading an extraordinary book, which is coming out, I think, in the next couple of days, and it's called Saris of Memory by Malvika Singh. And it's just such an extraordinary book because ostensibly it's a coffee table book and has these gorgeous pictures of saris, but it's really an ode to the unstitched fabric of India. And in that, what the author does is she kind of talks about her own. She's led a very varied and very interesting life, and she traces the trajectory of her work as a professional and her personal life through the saris that she owns. In doing that, she also ends up talking about, the history of India, if you will, and what makes India what it is through the story of the sari. And I know that this will be of interest to you, Mukulika, because you've done a fantastic book on the sari. And every single page of this book, I could not stop thinking about you, but it's an extraordinary book. So, and it's coming out soon. So I would definitely recommend people get their copies and read it. And the final set of books I want to talk about are Amitabh Kumar's journals. These are, again, like Saris of Memory, very sort of genre-defining books. Amitabh Kumar is a professor of creative writing, but he's also one of India. Of course, he lives in the US, but one of India's finest novelists. And he's been doing these journals, which are called the Blue Book, Yellow Book, and it's a trilogy. And the final one that just came out, the Green Book. They're titled the Writer's Journals, the Traveler's Journals, and the Observer's Journals. And I'm just fascinated by the format of these journals. They're part memoir, but sort of part just observations and notes. And I think it's just such a great entry point into a fine mind. So yeah, that's my book list. I wonder what you've been doing a lot of reading as well. And I know that you, despite the hours you keep, you try and read fiction before you go to bed every night. So I'm very curious to hear your list.
So, like you, I mean, thank you first, Pragya, for that reading list because I don't think I've read a single one of your favorites. So I shall amend that quickly, and now I know what to read next. It's on my list. So my to read list has a number of the ones that you've mentioned, but I didn't know about Malvika Singh's book. which sounds so close in spirit to my book that I co-authored with Daniel Miller, which was really, it was called The Sari, but it was about Indian women and modernity and why Indian women so uniquely continue to wear the sari, their traditional garment, not as costume, but as everyday dress across class, across caste, across region in India. So I can't wait to read that. And of course, I want to read Namita Gokhale's new novel. I always read her books, and Willie's The Golden Road is again sitting, waiting to be read, hopefully soon. But what I have managed to read, and I think in the nonfiction category, because I'm an academic and a social scientist, I read largely nonfiction all the time for work. But the two things as that I thought I'd mention, which are sort of less discussed, are two books that came out this year, which are a riff, are an interpretation of the Ramayana. And the Ramayana, of course, has such a political story in India. Ram, as the temple, we started with this, the temple to Ram in Ayodhya. Ram is the hero of the Ramayana. But a book that I have just acquired but are waiting to read is Vayu Naidu's new book called The Living Legend, which is a reinterpretation of the Ramayana for our times. And I've seen her, she's an incredible storyteller, and I've seen her do live storytelling in the Barbican and other places where she tells the story. So I know that she has a way of connecting these epics to the contemporary moment. And so I'm looking forward to reading that. The other was, of course, Vikram Seth, whom most people around the world know for A Suitable Boy, maybe even his first, The Golden Gate, which was written in iambic pentameter, was set in San Francisco. Vikram Seth finally published the English translation of the Hanuman Chalisa, which he'd been working on for many years, and it finally saw the light of day. And I was gifted a copy by a friend from India, a friend who knew that I've always recited the Hanuman Chalisa since I was 16 years old. It literally means 40 lines on Hanuman. Chalisas, 40. But it's a very popular prayer, a discipline, a self-cultivation of reciting this. It's a celebration of Hanuman, the friend of Lord Ram, who is there through thick and thin for him. And it's a celebration of Hanuman's qualities, which I have been deeply inspired by all my life. And what I love about Vikram Seth's translation is that because I know the rhythm of these lines, reciting them in Hindi, he's captured that rhythm in the English, which is, I think, just an extraordinary feat. So when you read it in English, even when you're reading it silently, the Chalisa, of course, you recite, you vocalize it. That's part of the discipline, and that's part of the prayer. But when you're reading in English, you read it and you hear that cadence really much. So I've always been a huge admirer of Seth's writings, but this feat I thought was exceptional. About fiction, let mention two or three books a couple of books that I discovered this year. I think both are first books by these new authors. One is The Rumor of Spring by Farah Bashir, a memoir really of her girlhood in Kashmir. Now, Kashmir is written about for its politics, for its importance in strategic conversations between India and Pakistan and the cause of wars. But here at the heart of all of this is a young woman remembering her growing up in Kashmir and brings to life what it is like to live in a territory which is occupied by the army, the Indian army, in trying to curb militancy and bring order, so to speak. But what is very powerful and potent is that it is about the somatic effects of that kind of threat of constant violence on the body, on the young girl's body, what it does to her period pain, what it does to stomach upsets, what it does to her grandmother's asthma, what it does to dreams, and so on. And so it's a phenomenology of living in an occupied territory. And of course, this has been the year where the genocide in Gaza has continued unabated. And we have all, I think, in our ways thought about at some point the absurdity of us carrying on with our lives, reading books, launching podcasts all the time that children and women and men have been decimated in their homes, in hospitals, on the streets in Gaza. So it was particularly potent reading Farah Bashir's book. The second one is, again, set on another border of India. If Kashmir is in the north, Assam in the east, The Red River by Somnath Bhattabayal. And again, this is a meditation on how individual biographies, friendships, loves intersect with grand national and international histories. India, Bangladesh, shifting borders, and what it does to people's lives, and the violence, and how friendship and love can flourish despite the displacement, the dislocation, and migrations of people. And again, because one always reads, like you said, you're right, I read fiction every night, and I read these stories after having studied India all day through social science, through nonfiction. One is aware that, what is happening in Assam at the moment in India is as close to ethnic cleansing. If you encounter the details of it, it is really quite worrying, the status of Bengali Muslims in this eastern state of Assam. And this is a current problem in India at the moment. The tension between the Muslim present speaking a different language, the language of the state of Assam, and how a state machinery is being brought about again to destroy schools, hospitals, homes, on the ostensible pretext that they're illegal but built by Bengali Muslims. And Shomnath's book, though set in the past in an earlier period, made one realize, as fiction so powerfully does, of thinking about what it is to live in these kind of circumstances. So these two books, I mean, I've read many books. I'm reading, well, I won't go into what I'm reading at the moment, maybe next time. But these two books made me think about India from the margins and what's happening there.
Look, absolutely. I'm going to
Also,
interrupt you for a second. I want to say that Shom's book is also, it is a huge miss that was not on my list. In my defense, it's because he's a dear friend and I have been reading earlier drafts of this book. So I had perhaps forgotten that it's a 2024 release.
publication.
I had the privilege of being in conversation with him at his launch, and it's an absolutely extraordinary book. And I think so much. You talked about Assam, but even if you want to really understand historically what's the background, the historical background and context to what's going on in Bangladesh right now, I think this book is, is just an absolutely essential reading. But it's hard. It's just such a powerful, wonderful story, even outside of its immediate political relevance and context. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I had to.
No, that's fine. Should we talk about films? Did you have any films in mind that stood out for you?
Yeah. No, I think it was a very bad year. I hope I'm not saying something controversial, but at least where Indian cinema is concerned, it was a very bad year. Personally speaking, there were very few films that really stood out. And I think the ones that I will talk about are the ones that are being talked about the most in this award season, particularly. What is interesting is that all the films that I really, really loved this year all have female directors, and that sort of warms the cockles of one's heart. With Lapata Ladies, which was India's entry to the Oscars, it didn't make it to the shortlist, but I absolutely adored that film. And by Kiran Rao, All We Imagine Is Light, Payal Kapadia's film, which has again been part of so many award conversations and has won so many awards, I absolutely loved. Santosh, which is UK's entry to the Oscars for Best Foreign Film, is, of course, a film about India made by Sandhya Suri, who's of Indian origin, and I absolutely love it. And Swigatu, which came out last year, made by Nandita Das, but had its OTT release this year, is also a film. I hadn't seen it last year, and I caught it this year, and I absolutely loved it. I have to say, disclaimer, Santosh and Zagato both star a dear, dear friend of mine, one of my closest friends, Shahana Goswami. So perhaps one is biased there, but I think both these films have been so widely admired critically that I'm on safe ground here. And commercial cinema, I watch a lot of Bollywood commercial cinema. It was really an awful year. I can't think of anything that I really enjoyed other than Merry Christmas that came out earlier this year, Sriram Raghavan's sort of neo-noir film, which I absolutely adored.
Um, um, I think my list overlaps with yours, though I haven't been lucky enough to catch Santosh yet. So I'm hoping it'll come to a festival near me before long. Nor have I watched Swagato, but I agree about Lapata Ladies and All We Imagine is Light. I've also, partly because of my colleague Pavitra, with whom I'm doing this work on taxation, who is, of course, she's Tamil, and has been introducing me to some key films from the South, which, as a Bengali and Hindi speaker, I don't always immediately engage with. And one film that I absolutely loved for its very nuanced male directors and actors' take on feminism was Chitta, which literally is the word for maternal uncle in Tamil. And the actor Siddharth, who plays the main role, was outstanding in it. The other one was a Kannada film, Kantara, which is magical. I think it's on one of the OTT platforms. It's a first time film by a director who there is everything in it. There's magical realism, there is the Indian state, there is love and loss, it is family dynamics. It's got, in that sense, it's got several ingredients and it works splendidly. And I hear Kantara 2 is in the making and should be out in 2025. So can't wait for that. Maybe I should, while we're talking about films and books and so on, worth mentioning this new exhibition in London that everybody is talking about, The Imaginary Institution of India, which is a curious title taken from the political theorist Sudipta Kaviraj's book, which basically this exhibition at the Barbican, which I recently caught, looks at the work of artists, Indian art, through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and especially at the art that was provoked and produced through the emergency and its aftermath. So, the emergency in India, when democratic rights were suspended in India in 1975, led to a brutal repression of democratic rights by Mrs. Gandhi. And artists, of course, as you and I, with our interest in art, know, Pragya, that artists are the conscience keepers. They are the ones we expect to be able to find the language through painting, through poetry, through writing, to articulate the hopes and anxieties and fears of the rest of us. And this exhibition looks at painters and sculptors and their production of work. And it was very curious now to look back through art at this period, standing in a London gallery, looking at this art that is speaking to a period that I remember vividly growing up through in Delhi, and remembering the anxieties, but also the hopefulness of the feminist movement, of the fight for women's rights, of gay rights, of the right to speak, the freedom to express, and so on, which these artists have captured in a variety of different modes of representation. And then one very key thing, and actually it turned out to be my favorite one, was, in this imagination of India that happened through these institutions that were set up, like Bharat Bhavan, visionary directors of institutions like this, one intervention was that indigenous artists from India's vast indigenous population, otherwise called tribal population, but really these are the indigenous populations of India, who have their own forms of art and representation, were invited into residencies in institutions like this to work with other collaboratively, again, with artists, just hang out with others, given studio, given materials, to produce their own art with the view of co-producing the modernity of India, rather than saying, okay, this is tribal art, this is, modern art, and this is figurative, and that produced works that were new, but the grammar was very recognizable. But what it represented in terms of the natural world was breathtakingly beautiful to me. So I know that everyone, I haven't heard one bad review of this exhibition. So kudos to the curators and the Barbican staging this. And if anyone can be in London before the 6th of January, I certainly recommend you go and see it.
I'm so envious that I'm going to miss this exhibition, but so happy you caught it. It sounds absolutely wonderful. It's been a great year for art in India. Art fairs are proliferating. We have a big one coming up in Delhi from the 6th of February. We have a big one in Mumbai that just concluded, Art Mumbai, that I was there for as well. A new one has been announced in Mumbai that will happen next year in November. Museums coming up in Delhi. The Humayun Tomb Museum was inaugurated earlier this year in the heart of Delhi, near Sundar Nursery. And it's a wonderful, wonderful museum. Two new museums of art are coming up, Bridge and the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art. So that's very exciting. The Center of Contemporary Art is just opened in Jaipur as well. So lots of focus on contemporary art. And the inaugural edition of Bengal Biennale was held last month as well in Calcutta and in Shantiniketan. So lots of fun stuff happening in art. And this is something that I think we should cover in some detail as we go along. But I was wondering, before we conclude, I was wondering, since we are talking so much about India, this morning I was making my list of resolutions. And one thing that is on my list of New Year resolutions to travel more within India. And I made a list of destinations that I want to cover this year. And I was wondering if you have any destinations in mind where you want to be this year.
This is blue skies thinking, but actually what is on the cards, I'm delighted to say, is my first ever trip to China. I have never been to China, but this year, for the first time, I gave a lecture remotely to a bunch of scholars and students who are studying India, Chinese scholars and students who are studying India. And I think what is going to materialize next year is actually a physical visit, master classes, and hopefully some travel after that. And on the back of that, it's worth saying, Pragya, that, in this engagement, I learned the huge commitment and money, resources, energy that is being put in by Chinese scholars in trying to understand India. They're learning languages, they're doing field work, they're living in India, producing knowledge, right? And as an Indian, it made me think, isn't it a shame that we don't have more of that in India? We used to have China study centers in Delhi University and elsewhere. People learned the language, knew about it. Sadly, they've actually shut down just at a point where then understanding of China is needed in India. I mean, regardless of, what happens in diplomatic strategy, they're neighboring nations and we need to understand each other better for just through research and dialogue. And so that's what I'm going to be definitely doing, hopefully, at the sometime in 2025. And the other country which I've never visited, which one of my dearest friends has moved to, is Mexico, which again I've been fascinated by, not least because of its political story. As a political anthropologist, Mexico is a dreamland to study these issues. But it also had an election this year. It elected a female president. There is some troubling signs of what is happening with the judiciary there. And so it's a politically volatile and interesting place. So I'm hoping to visit my friend and get to know this new country, inshallah.
Inshallah.
What about you?
I think for me, well, outside the country, the list is too long. So I'm going to stick with what I plan to do within the country. I want to go to this small town called Aurangabad. I've been there before, but I want to do the food trail in Aurangabad that I'm hearing very good things about. And Aurangabad also happens to be the gateway for Ajanta and Ellora caves, which are some of the oldest Buddhist cave structures, carvings, and Hindu temple carvings as well. Stunning caves of Aurangabad. Been to these caves when I was very young, but I haven't as an adult. So I want to go back to these caves and I think I will see them in a whole different light. And I'm looking forward to that. The other thing that's on my list is another cave, which is in Madhya Pradesh, which is the Bhimbetka caves, which have perhaps the world's oldest cave paintings dating back to 8,000 BC. And these are caves that I've never seen. I've heard so much about them. So that's on my list. And the final thing that's on my list is the Tadoba Wildlife Sanctuary in Maharashtra. Most of the tiger reserves all the tiger reserves that I've been to have been in North India, Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh and so on. So I'm really looking forward to going to Maharashtra, to Tadoba. I hear just the most extraordinary things about it. Before I close this list out and perhaps the podcast out, I would like to recommend Sam Dalrymple's Substack. Sam Dalrymple is an emerging historian. He's William's son. His first book should be out next year. But he's been doing something fascinating on his Instagram, which is he travels around India a lot and he sort of writes this historian's travelogue, if you will. And he's just introduced his Substack that people can subscribe to. And I find it absolutely fascinating the way in which he is writing about travel across India. And I think you will also, if you subscribe to it or you see his content on Instagram, be to inspired to travel within India a lot more.
Great. I think I would like to end with, sorry, I should say that I mentioned China because of this China-India issue, that Indians need to understand China better, and I hope I'll do my little bit. Communist Party was set up by an Indian, M.N. Roy, and of course the Communist Party in Mexico has been such an important force in its politics. So those were my India Connect. Sorry, I should have made that more obvious. But I would like to end with an Indian that made India incredibly proud this year by winning the Erasmus Prize, Amitav Ghosh, who was awarded in November by the King of the Netherlands, the Erasmus Prize. And for those of you who are admirers of Amitav Ghosh or haven't heard of him, please go and check him out. And in particular, please check his acceptance speech out, because I was very privileged to be present in the palace that evening, listening to him deliver this speech, and it's now available on the website of the Erasmus Prize, which has stayed with me because of two reasons. One is that Amitav Ghosh is a very fine novelist, of course. Many of us know that. I've read all his books, but he has been singularly raising the issue of climate change and why we should be paying attention to it. And he's done this. I mean, he's now based in New York. He grew up in India, but he's been doing this through his novels, but now also through nonfiction and books and history that he writes constantly. And there are two new books out in recent months. But I think he draws attention also to the fact that there are places like India which need to be aware of the fact that India's population is at risk alongside the rest of, say, South Asia in alarming ways. And we have to make this a central issue of all public conversations, which sadly is not. So we need to think about it. The other reason I think Amitav Ghosh's speech was so powerful, apart from this climate change issue, was he also spoke to a global audience and to a European audience, after all, in Amsterdam, reminding a European and Western audience how important it is to understand history. And without reckoning with the past, without reckoning with the history of colonialism and empire, it is impossible to have a sane understanding of immigration, which has become such a hot issue in Western contexts now and is leading the rise of right-wing populism. That without that reckoning of history, we are not going to understand immigration or climate change, which are probably some of the two biggest issues determining global politics today. So Amitav Ghosh is central to both those stories, and I would recommend engaging with his work to all listeners.
Excellent. This is quite a list of recommendations that we've both managed to put together, despite the fact that I'm fairly certain that we've not even scratched the surface of everything that we've engaged with this year. But with that, we will close this out. And as always, thank you for listening to us. This is a new podcast, and we're, like we keep saying, we're just so thrilled to be able to present this to you and to make you a part of this journey. And as always, write to us at tib@oijo.in. Share this, support us by sharing it, liking it, downloading it, subscribing to it. And we're forever grateful for the love you've shown us. And we hope to be able to live up to that love in the new year. Have a happy new year.
Thank you. Happy New Year.